Good to see all of you this morning. Glad you're here, and I hope you're glad you're here. Need to give you an update on one of our prayer requests right quick. If you notice in your bulletin down near the bottom of the prayer list that Bob and Becky Palmer's grandson and granddaughter were in a bad wreck. She passed away. She's 13 years old, and her brother is 11, and his right now expected recovery time is somewhere between a year and a year and a half. So he has got some very significant injuries, and he keeps asking about his sister. So y'all be much in prayer for that family as well as everybody on the list, if you would please. We have a lady visiting this morning, or our guest this morning for the first time with Judy. Minuan, is that anywhere close? You know, I can't pronounce your name very well, but we are so glad you're here. So all y'all get to know her. Not now. I know what you're going to do. You're going to all jump up and run back there. Wait just a little bit, all right? Chapter 2, Revelation. We started last week on the church at Ephesus, and I hope that you learned something about that church, and especially what the Lord was talking about with them. And we're going to go to another church this week that has a different type of message given to it, somewhat different than Ephesus did, and that's the church at Smyrna. So beginning in verse 8 of chapter 2, and unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Now, what's that referring to? Who's that referring to? Jesus, okay. I know, and of course this is Jesus speaking personally, I know thy works, your tribulation, and your poverty, but you are rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Now, what do you notice about the letter to Smyrna? There's no condemnation. They are not condemned for doing anything wrong. So that's an unusual thing. Out of these 7 churches, there are only going to be 2 of them who are going to get that kind of message. Well, where was Smyrna located? Of course, we're over here in the off the Aegean Sea. Ephesus is here, and Smyrna is right up above it, about 35 miles away. And I know you can see that from the back there, but that's what you get for sitting on the back, all right? But there's an inlet that comes off the sea there, so it's a seaport. It's in a natural harbor, so to speak. Now, if you go to Ephesus today, and I didn't know this last week, but after the class, Carl Granberry was telling me, he said, I've been to Ephesus twice. I said, why didn't you say something? You could have told us what it's like. He said, you already described it. He said, it's ruins. There are excavations there, there's archaeological work, and there's tourists that go. But that's it. And he said, I was there, I think he said in 1960, and then he was again there several years later. But I thought if he were here this morning, we'd get him to tell us a little bit about it. But I'm not sure what the situation is, but they aren't here. But anyway, Ephesus is in ruins. Smyrna is just, like I said, about 35 miles away, going up the coast there. Is Smyrna still in existence today? Yes, it is. The city of Smyrna, it's not called Smyrna anymore. It's called Izmir, Turkey, Izmir. And there's a population of somewhere around 275 to 300,000 people. It's still an active seaport. There's a lot of activity going on there and everything else. So it has survived all these years. It is the birthplace, or was the birthplace, of the poet Homer, which you probably had to read in school at some point. I think, what was that he wrote? The Iliad and the Odyssey or something like that. It was kind of an oddity to me too. But anyway, in the 6th century, Smyrna was totally destroyed by an invading army, and it lay there for 3 centuries, for 300 years. And then Alexander the Great conquered the world, during the Grecian conquest, and he had it rebuilt, and it still exists today. There were a lot of armies that invaded it, and they also had a lot of earthquakes there. So this city has been destroyed or partially destroyed many times over the history of its lifetime, but it still exists today. So we start off, and Christ identifies himself as the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Now, did that have any kind of connection or any reference to Smyrna? Well, yes, it probably did, because there are some symbolic things here that can be attributed to that comment. One is that Smyrna comes from the word myrrh. Myrrh was, remember, what one of the wise men brought to baby Jesus when they came and worshiped him. When he actually was about 2 years old by then, probably, but still, it was a perfume used in the embalming process, and it was kind of a not a rarity, but it was not everybody had it. You had to have a little money to buy it, and so. But this is where Smyrna, basically, one of the derivatives of the name comes from, and Smyrna also was one of the principal cities that was to worship the Caesars, the Roman Caesars, the Roman emperors. The pain and the suffering and all of that was felt by the Christians at Smyrna was imposed by the Romans and by the Jews and by the economic community. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But they are recognized for their faith and for their suffering, because they truly were suffering during this time. And this was something that God appreciated, God saw as a good thing. Not that God wants people to suffer, but when you're suffering, you usually get closer to God than when you aren't suffering and everything's going really well. Now, obviously, Jesus was aware of their works. He's aware of everything. Notice he says that he which was dead and is alive. I know thy works, the tribulation and the poverty, but you are rich. So he's fully aware of what's going on with them, as he is everything and everything with us. But they were being persecuted not only by the government, but by the Jews, and also by the system, the economic system. Now, why was that? Well, if you worked or if you had a business in Smyrna and it was found out that you were a Christian, then you were likely to be looted, to be vandalized, or just nobody would buy anything from you and your business would fail. If you looked for work in Smyrna, you had to join the guild, which is similar to a union, and part of that guild requirement was that you had to pray to a pagan god. You couldn't just do your own thing, but you had to pray to a pagan god and offer gifts or offer sacrifices to that deity that was over that guild or associated with that guild. You had to burn incense to it. You had to bow down. You had to worship it. And when Christians refused to do that, then they lost their job. They couldn't work. They couldn't even get a job because no one would hire them because they could not be a part of the guild. Now, the question is, if that was the case and you were a working person and you were, had a good job and making decent money, and they said, now you're going to have to worship this pagan deity and you're going to have to burn incense to it and you're going to have to worship or show obeisance to it, what would you say?
Sorry.
Say what?
Bye-bye.
Oh, bye-bye. Okay. All right. Probably none of us have been in that situation. But now you think about it. If you lose that job, you're not going to get another one because nobody's going to hire you if you are a Christian in Smyrna at this time. Is there any other option that you might take? Well, the people of Smyrna thought, maybe I can just play like I'm worshiping. But then they found out that that wasn't pleasing to God, so they didn't do it. And they said, bye-bye, They left the job or they got fired. Well, this is not the only place that this has ever happened. In the 2nd century, in 200 AD, and actually that would be the beginning of the 3rd century, in northern Africa, there was a pastor by the name of Tertullian. Tertullian was confronted by this ideology within his church. The people in the congregation were ordered by the trade union or the guild where they worked that they had to burn incense and worship a particular god that was the god of that trade or whatever. And he told them, or he didn't, he asked them, he said, well, why do you do that? And they said, well, we have to work. He said, why do you have to work? Well, we got to eat. Why do you have to eat? Because that's the only way we can stay alive. And he said, you do not have to work or eat or live. The only thing you have to do is be true to God, true to Christ. Now think about what he was saying. If you were a good, solid believer in his church, and you worked at one of these places in this guild, and you went in and worshiped the pagan god, but you didn't mean it, you were just play acting, and you burned incense, but you didn't mean it, and then you went on to work, are you giving a false witness? And that's what he was trying to tell them. Your witness is worth more than your job. It's worth more than your work. It's worth more than you eating. It's even worth more than your life. Now, does that have any application in today's society? Are there people who play Christian who aren't? And are there people who are Christians who look like the world because they're not faithful enough or strong enough, or they think it's going to be an inconvenience to them? I think so in both counts. These people lived in poverty. The reason they were in poverty is because they would not submit to pagan worship, and the guild would not allow them to work. So they just did whatever they could do. They may not have owned any land because they lived in the city, and they might not have been farmers, and so they were tradesmen, they were artisans and all of that, but they could not find work. And he says, I understand your poverty. I know you're in poverty, but you're really rich. So there's a difference there between worldly rich and spiritually rich. And many times, unfortunately, God's people choose worldly rich over spiritually rich. Early church records from Smyrna indicate that they had a pastor named Polycarp, and you may have read about him or know about him. Polycarp eventually was arrested because he was a Christian, and he refused to bow down to Caesar and worship Caesar and all of that. Well, he's taken before the Roman proconsul, which would be kind of like Pontius Pilate during Jesus' day, but he ruled that region, and he was taken before the proconsul, and he commanded him to declare in public, Caesar is Lord. Polycarp said, I'm not going to do that. For 86 years, I have followed after Jesus, and he has never done anything to me to harm me or anything. He's always taken care of me. Why would I say now that Caesar's Lord when my Lord is the true Lord? So what do you think happened? Polycarp said, well, don't say that anymore and go home. No, He said, if you don't confess Caesar as Lord, I'm going to set you on fire. What do you think Polycarp said? He basically said, you can burn with fire for an hour and then it's over with, but God will burn with fire for everlasting eternity for those who don't believe. In other words, he was telling the Pope Council, you're going to burn forever. You may burn me for a little bit, but you're going to burn forever because you're not serving the true and the living God. So he was threatened with fire, and he basically said, bring it on. In so many words. What are you waiting for? Let's get this over with. Now, he was tied to a stake, and who do you think gathered up the wood? Roman soldiers? No. Other artisans? No. The Jews. The Jews went out and gathered the wood to burn this man, to have him, burned alive. And he was. And so as the fire was burning and it was, getting hotter and hotter on him, he gave thanks to the Lord. He shouted out and gave thanks to the Lord that he was allowed to be a martyr for Jesus Christ. Now, you think about that. Would we be willing to go that far? Are we that committed to God, to Christ, that we would actually let somebody set us on fire on purpose and then praise God for it? It'd be a tough decision. We'd always like the comfortable way, and being in a fire is not a comfortable thing. So would we capitulate or stand firm in our faith? That's the kind of people that were at Smyrna. That's the kind of pastors they had at Smyrna. That's the kind of faith that they had at Smyrna. They may lose their job, they may lose their life, but they were faithful to the Lord. That's why there is no condemnation of Smyrna in chapter 2 here. If you look at verse 9 then, he says, and I know your works. In other words, I know what you're doing. I know your heart. I know what your intent is, and your intent is to serve God, and it's to serve Christ, and it is to be faithful. I know your tribulation, the economic tribulation, the government tribulation, the problem with the Jews, the tribulations that they were having with the Jews and all that. And I know your poverty. I know you're having trouble making ends meet. I know you're having trouble, feeding yourselves. But then he says, but you're really rich. Now, how can you get richness out of all of that? Because God sees things in a different way than we do. We might be rich for a while. Back in the 20s, when the Great Depression hit, there were people who had millions of dollars. But because of an economic turndown that happened basically overnight, they were penniless. And just like that, they had nothing. So putting your faith in worldly riches is not going to secure you from anything. But he said, you're rich because you have accepted Jesus as your Savior. You're rich because you're going to be in heaven. You're rich because you're going to be rewarded when the day comes. And so they had that promise, but they believed that promise, and they lived that promise out. Okay?
What does it mean when it says that they'll have tribulation 10 days?
Okay, we're going to talk about that here in just a second. So he says, I know your works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Now, what did he mean by the synagogue of Satan? The Jews weren't worshiping God. They said they were, but they were worshiping themselves. They were worshiping whatever they wanted to. And so the synagogue that they claimed to be that God's house, so to speak, wasn't. It was Satan's house. They even made a coalition with the Roman government, which they hated, to attack the Christians. So it was like I hate you, but I hate the Christians worse, so let's work together to get the Christians. And kind of like it was when Jesus was taken before Pilate. Who carried him? The Jews did. They put him before him. They wanted Pilate to do their dirty work for him, and he wouldn't do it, and then he finally let them do it. So anyway, we see that he talks about the blasphemy of them. The blasphemy is not, as we normally use the word blasphemy, where it's cursing God or rejecting God. But in this case, blasphemy means that you are, I forgot my word. Oh, good night. Slander. That you slander someone. These people were being slandered from every corner, every direction. Everybody was after them about something. So, but they were faithful, which what we have got to continue to remember, they were faithful. Why were they slandered? Well, first of all, they were called cannibals because when they took the Lord's Supper and said, this is my body and this is my blood, they were called cannibals for doing that. They weren't cannibals, but that was a way of slandering them. When they were talking about that the world will come to a fiery end and it will be burned up, they were called arsonists, that they were going to be the ones that started the fire that burned the world up. There was a lot of insinuation. There was a lot of people who making up things, but it became believable. The city got to kind of having a mob mentality, if you will. And so even the Jewish synagogues in some of those cities in the early days, when they weren't having services, they would let the Christians have services in it. Well, that stopped. They put an end to that, forced them to go to homes or even into hiding or secret to have their church services. So he said that you're right in the middle of the synagogue of Satan. You're living where Satan is flourishing and controlling, but you're being faithful. He continues to give them high marks and praise for what they're doing. All right. Then he says, in verse 10, for none of these things which thou shalt suffer, behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. So, since I don't know what that means, I'm going to ask Bernie, because she studies a lot, to answer that for us.
Well, I just know that if you're faithful unto death, then I'm going to get that crown of life, because James 1:12 tells me that.
Okay, that's right. What about the 10 days?
I don't know anything.
It's a short period of time, and if you go back into Daniel, with him and his friends, they were suffered for 10 days. They were tested for 10 days.
Okay. All right. There are beliefs, people who study the scriptures and everything, who say that this is a 10-day period of time. Now, when this was written, it would have been in the future. And in that 10 days is going to be intense persecution. Okay? There's another thought that the 10 days is symbolic, and it is symbolic of the fact that there were 10 oppressive Caesars from Nero to Diocletian. So each one of them would be considered a day, but each one of them put great stress and tribulation upon the Christians during that time. And so that may be what refers to the 10 days. And then also there's some that believe that the 10 is just a number that's thrown out, that it's representative of a long time. But, you can pick out the one that you want. There's no definitive answer that I'm aware of. But there is historical evidence that there were 10 Caesars from Nero to Diocletian who oppressed the Christians. Okay? Sandy?
This is just some question of if you study Bible numerology, We already know that 7 means complete, and 3 is the Trinity, and 5 is grace. 10 always represents judgment.
Okay. 10 days of judgment. Okay. And notice what he says is going to happen in those 10 days. Some of you are going to be put into prison. Some of you are going to be tried, and that may be tried by physical torture. And then, of course, some of them were even killed, like Polycarp. They died for their faith. So when we're talking about persecution, what is it? What are the purposes of persecution? Why would we be allowed to be persecuted? Why would God allow that? Why didn't he take care of us and keep us away from persecution?
Are we better than Christ?
I'm sorry?
Are we better than Christ?
Yeah. Are we better than Christ? Absolutely not. And he was persecuted. But there's basically 4 reasons for persecution. One is that it is a discipline or a punishment for acting incorrectly. So if you sin and you continue to sin and you continue to sin, you can expect God to take action at some point in time. He's going to persecute or discipline you for that sin. The second thing is it is a preventative. It keeps us from sinning because we understand that God's watching us. God's got control over us. God's got his hand on us. And if we step out of line, so to speak, we can expect chastisement. You know, the Lord talked about the chastisement thing, which is another word for persecution here. Think about Paul. He had the thorn in the flesh, whatever that was. But he suffered with that all the time. He asked it be taken away, but God said, no, you're going to keep that. That's going to be something you're going to have to live with. So it was always there as a reminder of his commitment to serve God. The third thing is it creates a learning cycle or an obedience cycle to God. Christ suffered, so we need to be expecting, to suffer also. Maybe not in the same way he did, maybe not in the same capacity, certainly, but we will be called to task, so to speak, because of our faith, and it helps us to learn obedience. It helps us to stay on the straight and narrow, so to speak. And then fourthly, it provides a better testimony for Christ. When you're dealing with someone who's going through a trying time, and if you've been through a similar circumstance, then you can honestly tell them how the Lord helped you through that. You can give them some firsthand reference of how God saw you through that time and be an encouragement to them that if they trust in the Lord, then he is their only hope of really coming through those times. The Lord said, fear none of these things because you're going to suffer. They knew they were going to suffer. But yet, it's still impressive to me that with all that and all the things that they were putting up with, that they were still faithful. When you contrast that to Christians today, how would we stack up? If you went to the church at Smyrna in that day and you walked in and you said, hey, I'm from Red Springs, it's a little ways down the road there, but I want to join your church. I'm a Christian. I'm a believer. Well, what kind of persecution have you been under? Well, they had the air conditioner too cold one day in church. I was kind of uncomfortable. What do you think those people would say?
Probably laugh at you.
Yeah, probably wouldn't even let you in the church. They'd probably say you some kind of, false prophet or something. But that's the kind of things, I tell you what, if you want persecution today, just let the preacher go over on his sermon past 12 o'clock. That guy's persecuting us. We're not going to beat the Methodist to the restaurant. Well, if you really want persecution today, you go to Sudan, Nigeria, North Korea, Iran, any of those places, and you just say, I'm a Christian, and they're going to say, you're going to die, and they mean it, and they do it. We don't face that yet. That day's coming. We may not be here for it if the rapture's occurred, and should have by then, hopefully, but it's coming. Sandy?
At a national meeting, our national meeting a couple of 3 years ago, one of the missionaries from the Middle East, I don't remember the name, but he told of a family that was converted under his ministry over there, and they got word in the middle of the night that they'd better run for the border, that they were coming, they were killing everybody that was Christian, and this really happened. This family had a boy that was crippled, and his daddy, they were going places that were in terrain that you couldn't drive, you know, and so they had to walk. And the daddy wound up putting his son in a rocking chair and tying it to his back and carrying the boy. And when he got so far, they were like 12 or 13 miles from the border, and they could hear the motors of that were coming to kill him. He set that boy down, and he had to make a choice. Either stay with him, the family stay with him, and they all die, or they had to leave the boy. And they said he left him, and the boy begging him, don't leave me, don't leave me, don't leave me. You and I haven't seen persecution. We haven't seen anything like that. Mm-hmm. But that really happened in our day.
Yeah. So,
I just looked up something, and it says there's 10 days of awe, and during that 10 days, it's repentance and atonement that goes on in the 10 days.
Okay.
It's from one day to a time of, I forget what the other one said, but it's a feast.
Okay. All right. But, these people expected persecution, and they got it. But Jesus tells them, I know what you're going through, but you're rich. And then he tells them in verse 11, verse 10, at the end of verse 10, he says, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Now, we have had a very easy go of being Christians in this country. I mean, I don't know of any of us who have been truly persecuted. We might have been inconvenienced, but we have not been persecuted. There is persecution coming. We'll find that out later in Revelation during the Great Tribulation as to what's going to happen to Christians and Jews and all of those who rebuke the Antichrist. But we haven't seen that. We need to be very thankful that we've got what we've got and haven't had to go through what they went through. But what's the flip side of that? These people were going through tribulation and persecution, and they were faithful, and they were witnessing, and they were worshiping. But we've got it so easy, we don't even, there's a lot of people today who are members of our church who could be right here. This room wouldn't hold them all. But it's, I'm not coming today. I don't feel like it. I'll watch so-and-so on television. I'll get my religion through television. I don't have to come to church. Why did God say, or the Bible say, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together if coming to church wasn't important? Or why didn't he just say, watch him on television, But Christianity has become so convenient for us that we make the decision what we'll do, when we'll do it, and how we'll do it. And many people today have even made the decision what their Christianity will be. God's not going to send anybody to hell because he loves everybody and we're all going to heaven. Now, you show me that in the Bible and I'll change my way of thinking about it. But that's not what Jesus said. Hell is a real place. He talked more about hell than he did about heaven, if you count the references in there. Or, there's all kinds of things that people have concocted. Now it's, you have whole churches that are made up of homosexualism and homosexual ideas. Read Leviticus. Read Romans. Where did they get that? Synagogue of Satan. So, if you were to describe Smyrna at this point, how would you describe them? One that suffered, one that was troubled but was triumphant, or maybe ravaged but rewarded, or promised a reward. You know, you could come up with a lot of different things to say about them, but the thing we have to remember is Smyrna trusted and served and was faithful to God.
Psalms 56:11, in God I trust and am not afraid what man can do.
Okay, Psalm 56:11. You might want to look that one up. Read it again, Bill, loud.
In God I trust and am not afraid what can man do to me.
In God I trust. Why can I be afraid of what man can do to me? Psalm 56:11. Let's talk. I'm sorry.
What was mentioned last weekend was that about the abortion and taking the prayer out of school.
Mm-hmm.
And Christians didn't stand up at
Exactly.
the time, the ones that could vote. And they allowed this one woman to come in and to do all that. We were talking about this yesterday. We may not be persecuted for being Christians, but we will answer for not doing what we should be doing and defending Christians.
Two sides of the coin.
Uh-huh.
Yep. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Everything you've been saying sums up in Acts 20 and 24.
Okay.
Paul had just got through naming all the things he had been through. He had been beaten, he'd been this and that. And he said in 24th verse of 20th chapter, but none of these things move me. Neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy and the ministry which I have received of the Lord Jesus to testify of the gospel of the grace of God.
All right. Acts 24:27 and following.
20 and 24.
20 and 24. Excuse me. I submit to you that American Christians have never been persecuted to the point to really test their faith. Now, we think we've been tested. We think we've had some hard times. And I'm not making light of the fact that maybe you had cancer or maybe you were in war or things like that. But even that is not the kind of test these people were going under. They were hated simply because of their faith, not because of who they were or where they lived or what they did or anything else. The church at Smyrna was poor financially. It was persecuted, but it had a faith that was off the charts. And until we experience true persecution, we don't really know how strong our faith is, I don't think. Now, you don't have to agree with that. That's just my thought. But I don't think we're really going to know. If we really had a belief like they did, then we wouldn't be afraid to go to North Korea or Nigeria or Sudan or any of those places and preach the gospel. And there are people over there who are doing it at the risk of losing their life. But I'd rather sit in air conditioning and sit on a soft pew and, listen to the preacher through a PA system so it's easy to hear, and then go, amen, and then go to the restaurant. That's persecution to me, having to wait to eat lunch. Think about it. What has really happened to test your faith? And there's different levels of testing. There's different things that will test you, and we will all be tested. But persecution is the critical one. That's the one that really lets you know where you stand. Is Christ the priority of the church in America today? Well,
He should be.
maybe depending upon which church you're talking about. But remember what the church is. The church is people. So is he the priority of Christians today? The priority of people who have accepted Christ today? Is that where we're putting our trust, our faith, and our strength? Or are we playing church on Sunday and then, doing something else during the rest of the week? Maybe, we want to be comfortable, or maybe we want to be entertained, or maybe we want leisure time, or whatever. Turn back in the Old Testament to Deuteronomy chapter 11. Deuteronomy chapter 11. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay. Deuteronomy 11. Look at verse 18. Therefore shall you lay up these my words in your heart and in your soul. Yeah, I'm in the right place. And bind them, or sign upon a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. And ye shall teach them your children, speaking of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walk by the way, and when thou lie down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt write them upon the doorpost of thine house and upon thy gates, that your days may be multiplied, and the days of your children in the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers to give them, as the days of heaven upon the earth. For if you diligently keep all these commandments which I have commanded you to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, and to cleave unto him, then will the Lord drive out all these nations from before you, and ye shall possess greater nations and mightier than yourselves. Now, this was written to the Jews, right? This was written to God's people after they left Egypt. Does it have any application to us today? Absolutely. We're God's people, right? We're the saved. We're the ones who have received Christ. But notice what he starts saying. Lay up the words, my words, in your heart. How often do we study the scriptures? Some of you study a lot. Some of us don't study quite so much. Bind them upon your hand. See that there be frontlets between your eyes. In other words, you're keeping the Bible before you at all times. That is your methodology. That is your way of keeping in close contact with God, that you know his word and you're following his word. You're doing his will. He says, put it on the doorpost of your house and then upon your gates. Now, we may put political stickers out in the yard, but how many times do we put something out there that's proclaiming Christ? So people will know that we live there, or that God is welcome there. So think about those scriptures. Think about Smyrna. Think about what the church at Smyrna is saying to us individually, because, again, this was a letter to a church, but the church is made up of people, so it's a letter to individuals. And this letter is 2,000 years old, and it's still appropriate today. Are we as faithful as Smyrna? What other application do you see? All right. I didn't know that I knew everything, but now I'm assured of it. Okay. Thank you for being here this morning. Study about Pergamos next week. A little different deal when we get to Pergamos. It's not going to be told the same thing Smyrna was, and there's going to be some issues that they have to deal with. All right. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for your blessings. Thank you for each one who has come this way.